Welcome to the Sisterhood of Limitless Living. I'm Dr. April Moreno, autoimmune wellness researcher and professional helping women around the world to live their best possible lives despite the autoimmune condition. Listen in as we speak on various topics about the autoimmune journey and interview amazing and inspiring women who are living and thriving despite their autoimmune condition. Let's get started. Hello, Sisterhood. Welcome to another episode of the Sisterhood of Limitless Living. We are at episode number 49 today. We are so close to episode 50. Should we celebrate? We are halfway to 100 episodes. It is pretty exciting. The first quarter of the year is about to be completed, ending the first quarter of this year. And I want to know how you're doing. How is 2020 working well for you? How are you treating 2020? It's been a really cool year. It's been very different from 2019. I would say drastically different from 2019 in the fact that I began the yoga journey this year. I've been going to over 35 classes. I've been to over 35 yoga classes this year. I'm going to keep doing my best to as many classes as possible. I feel incomplete. I feel unfulfilled if I don't go to my yoga class. I'm really into a variety of different styles. I'll go to a sculpt class, which involves weights as well, so it's very cardio. I'll also go to vinyasa class. Tends to be a little bit more intense. It's a little bit more of a workout. It includes a lot of the power yoga poses, the warrior poses. It's a lot of sweating. And then another one I really love is the restorative yoga, which is actually my favorite. It's very relaxing. Then we have 101 class where you just kind of go through the basic sequences of yoga, doing teacher training. And so we're several weeks into the teacher training now. It goes through until next month. And I love it so much. It's actually there's much more depth to it than I expected. So we talk about the philosophy of yoga. We talk about the principles of yoga, the way of thinking and the way of being involved in yoga. Yoga has a set of rules. It's almost like the 10 Commandments in a way where there are certain behaviors and they're very similar. I'll probably do a separate episode on the 8 yoga principles. That's a lot of fun. So it's really changing the way I think about everything I do. Everything is very much more intentional. Some of it involves being organized, being clean, not being wasteful with your resources. And I'm starting to notice I'm approaching things very differently, approaching my business very differently, my actions and my thoughts, and also the decisions that I make are very different now because I look at it from a place of acceptance and appreciation and gratitude for the resources that I do have. Once I look at it with new eyes like this, I start to see that there are definitely things that I have around me that versus constantly looking at things that I don't have and what's missing. We talk about a scarcity mindset or we talk about the abundance mindset. And I've been focusing in on thinking more about abundance for quite some time now. Several years actually, and observing and noticing those moments when you don't catch yourself and you see that there are times when there's a scarcity mindset in some aspect of living still. And that's what I've been working with most recently. Addressing and noticing behaviors I've always had that are more scarcity minded and slowly beginning to remove those. It's been a process over the years. I know there were days when I was really much more scarcity minded and things have changed a lot. And I think yoga has helped me a lot with that process as well. Who knew? It's such a mind, body, spirit, and environment. It's a very integrative experience to work with yoga. And so I'm excited about the teacher training. I'm excited about completing the 200 hours. I'm looking into my 500 hours. I'm considering the 1,000 hours. It's just a way of living and I love it so much. Not to mention the fact that my muscles are getting toned. I'm more flexible. I'm in my 40s now. It's we're at that point where it's use it or lose it. It's time to start building up more physical fitness, longevity, and ways of thinking and acting. It's just been a huge lifestyle change this year with the whole yoga practice. Spring is approaching, and so I have to get out there and kind of tend to my garden. So I have some really nice plants in the backyard, but my gosh, we have these white flies and they are attacking my hibiscus. If any of you are into gardening, white flies are this horrible thing that's just been part of my garden for the whole time, and they're attacking my leaves. My hibiscus basically it's it's almost a tree. It's a hibiscus bush that is very tall. But over the past, I turned my head for a week and this thing is about to fall apart. The branches are breaking in half. The leaves are falling off. Everything's drooping and it's covered with white flies and this fur that they leave under the leaves, and the leaves are turning black. Some of them are turning yellow. It's awful. So gardening is something else. It's total defense against all kinds of other environmental interactions out there, and protecting the plant survival is something else when you're doing gardening work. We can liken it to ways of thinking in terms of our lives as well, just protecting our ways of thinking, our living, the things that we do, our nutrients, being very vigilant about what we choose to think and do, because there are so many environmental influencers out there that can affect the way that can change and modify the things that we do. So similarly, I see it in my garden. So yesterday was Rare Disease Day, February 29th, leap year day. It's always a special day, right? To see people on Facebook celebrating their 3rd birthday, their 4th birthday, their 10th birthday, because their birthday's only once every 4 years. But also this year it was Rare Disease Day. To celebrate Rare Disease Day and to give appreciation to Rare Disease Day, today we are speaking to somebody who lives with a rare autoimmune condition. In many ways, we still see that some of the major conditions, type 1 diabetes, some types of lupus, rheumatoid arthritis, and even MS sometimes get categorized as rare diseases, slowly not being mentioned as much in that space. But I have several approaches, several ways of thinking about rare disease, but there are definitely some autoimmune and chronic conditions out there that are definitely rare in terms of no known treatment, no known medication, a very small handful of sample size of the population who's going to be involved in clinical trials. There's not much known about the course of the diseases. There's not much known about overall prognosis. So yeah, I wanted to give some special focus on these conditions as well. Then my other approach is, my gosh, as women of color, some of us are women of color in this community, and just not even knowing what that looks like for us. We're starting to see in certain types of diseases, certain conditions where they do these studies and they find that certain groups may have more severe disease course, more tendency toward disability, less effectiveness from taking certain drugs. Definitely certain characteristics that we are seeing among people of color with autoimmune diseases, even among the top 10 diseases. And these continue to be topics that I'm very interested in. These are things that I'm continuing to be very concerned about, and I'm going to continue to do my part to help bring visibility to the voices and the experiences of diverse people, so that everyone equitably has a voice and the opportunity to thrive and grow and live well despite the autoimmune condition. And actually in our interview today, we speak to Monica Aldarondo, and she is going to be sharing her experiences with PSC. Look forward to sharing her episode with you. One of the great points that she made was that in community spaces, when we're looking at autoimmune diseases or chronic diseases, you will find that people go to support groups or talk in Facebook and ask questions because they're really suffering. They need someone to talk to. They want answers to something that they're going through, and they're looking for a place to get comfort and a place for community to feel that they're not alone. A lot of communities out there are for people who are totally struggling, totally hurting. They're looking for community. They want to feel understood, and I totally get that. The Sisterhood of Limitless Living podcast and Facebook community is a little different in the fact that, and she mentions this as well, when you're doing well, you don't hear a lot of people getting on social media and saying, hey, I'm doing great. There's not a whole lot of that sort of conversation out there. And that's okay, because then you want to keep moving on with your life. When you feel well, you don't want to think about being sick. I totally get that. But the Sisterhood of Limitless Living is a little different in the fact that we are focused on the thriving aspect. We don't talk about autoimmune disease all the time. We talk about other aspects of living. She also mentions this in the episode that we're about to talk about. What is it like to live with the condition? I love that she mentions this in our conversation. In her podcast, PSC Mommy, she talks about the fact that it's not so much about the clinical conversation. It's more to do with the everyday living. So I'll let her talk more about that. Overall, I just wanted to say the Sisterhood of Limitless Living, this is a place for women living with any of the 100 or so types of autoimmune conditions out there, where you can go for community and thriving information on how to be proactive, how to live well, how to enjoy your life, and how to improve your quality of life. I like to think of the Sisterhood of Limitless Living as our own virtual blue zone. I'll say that again. I like to think of our sisterhood as a virtual blue zone where together, wherever we are, regardless of space, location, we can thrive and live long, amazing lives. So one of my favorite goals here is permanent remission. And I know that doesn't apply to everybody because in some cases there's going to be remission because of age or the stage of the actual condition. For me, I like to think of it as permanent remission where the autoimmune condition is calmed down and it's not in a state of panic. You're not in a state of attack, fight or flight. You're not in defense mode. You're not in attack mode. You are at peace. Let me go ahead and give the mic to Monica Aldorondo, and she will be sharing her information about PSC and being a mother and her podcast, PSC Mommy. Hello, Sisterhood. Welcome to another episode of the Sisterhood of Limitless Living podcast. Today, we're going to be commemorating and speaking about rare diseases because Rare Disease Day is around this time of year. This year, it's on February the 29th. So the intention of this episode is to connect to that particular day this year. And so today, we want to give special attention to the topic of rare diseases and give attention to autoimmune conditions and rare diseases. So today we're going to be speaking to somebody here who's going to be sharing her experience and also the work that she's been doing in rare disease awareness. So today we are speaking to Monica Aldorondo, and she's going to be sharing her work as a podcaster. She's also a photographer and a mom to a 4-year-old. Welcome, Monica.
Thank you so much. So glad to be here.
Thank you so much. Please tell us a little bit about yourself.
Sure. Hello, I'm Monica, and we'll start with the rare disease, right? So I've had primary sclerosing cholangitis, which is better known as PSC, for about 11 years. And PSC is thought, they're not actually sure, to be a disease that about 30 to 40,000 Americans in the United States have, but it's fairly rare. I used to live in Boston. I used to tell people, you can't even fill Fenway Park with the amount of people who we know have PSC. So for those who have that reference, PSC is a disease that affects the bile duct. So just like all autoimmunity is inflammation of different parts of the body, our particular part of the body is the bile ducts in the liver. And the scarring there is what eventually can lead to cirrhosis and liver failure. And right now, for most people who have that path in the disease progression, then need a liver transplant. So I had my transplant 3 years ago last week, and have been doing really well as a result of that treatment. We say it's a treatment, not a cure, because in my case, I may have recurrent PSC, which happens in about 20% of post-transplantees that had PSC. Also, along with PSC, 70% of us have some form of IBD. So my form is colitis. I have ulcerative colitis as well. I was diagnosed with both at the same time. I've been on this journey of autoimmunity for 11 years. The diagnosis took a while. The diagnosis was something that was tough to get, but once I did, thankfully I had really great care in Boston and now in the San Francisco Bay Area.
So if you could tell us a little bit more about how the diagnosis took place.
For me, it took about a year. For me, it began with really irrational itching. So I had bruises when I woke up in the morning from scratching while I was sleeping. And a couple of doctors I went to initially told me it was dry skin. It was my first instance of the privilege of having great healthcare was that I didn't need a referral, and I finally just took myself to a dermatologist. And that dermatologist, thankfully, she said, yes, dry skin, take cold showers, blah, 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 just in case I'm going to do some blood tests. And then when she got those back, she was like, you need to go back and see your doctor. Your liver numbers are out of whack. So from there, it began the journey through the getting a hepatologist and doing lots of testing. When the colitis appeared, because they're sort of traveled together, that's when they said, oh, this is probably what's happening. And it's confirmed with, in my case, it had to be confirmed with time because it just sort of wasn't showing up clinically other than my symptoms. But eventually that did progress and was pretty clear that that's what's going on.
Is this something that someone in your family may have had in the past?
In my case, there's no one that was known to have PSC. My family does have a history of colitis on both sides, but not the liver portion. So I've been the first one to have it.
I guess it's good that because of the fact that they are paired together, not that it's great to have both, but that they're paired together, that they were able to come to the diagnosis possibly a lot quicker because of
Absolutely.
that.
Yeah.
So what is the treatment like, that process like for PSC?
Yeah, currently there are no approved treatments that are guaranteed to work. As a rare disease, that's not a unusual story. There are a couple things that they will try to sort of slow or that they believe might affect symptoms. So they mostly treat symptoms. There's an amazing patient advocacy group called PSC Partners for Seeking a Cure. The structure of this group has been so incredible at partnering with not only research institutions, but also even pharmaceuticals, getting clinical trials going. Really, the money that we raise goes to seed grants. So those seed grants then encourage researchers to be interested in our disease. I mean, the way they've approached it to me has just been astounding and incredibly successful. In the last 10 years, now we go to our annual patient conference and there's so much hope and there's research saying we think we're getting there. There's things going on. There's a few clinical trials. But at this point, there's really no effective ones that work across the board. There's a couple of things that people anecdotally have had luck with. But as you talk to doctors, sort of sometimes try and see. And even those anecdotal, there's no research. There's a medication right now that I'm asking my doctors about, but the only study has 8 patients. And they're like, we're not putting you on a medication for 8 patients. That only 8 patients have been on a study. That's, I think, a common challenge for a rare disease.
That makes a lot of sense. Yeah, the sample size is so small that it's difficult to test the medications to make sure that they're safe and then that they're effective.
Exactly.
But it's good to hear about the community, that you're able to meet people at these conferences with PSC and that you're supporting each other. I think that's really, really good. Based on my experience, not all support communities are supportive.
Absolutely.
It's really good to hear that you do have that community of support for it. Tell us a little bit more about the podcast that you do for PSC and the topics that you discuss and some of the things that you've learned along the way from others.
In a lot of the older PSC write-ups that you find online, they will say that when you have PSC, you have about a 10-year mortality rate. There's a 10-year timeline for mortality. When I was diagnosed, I was about 5 years in, was getting worse, and was really believing that statistic. So I went to one of the patient conferences, and one of the things that I was in the process of grieving and mourning was being a mom. I was like, if I'm going to pass away within 5 years, I can't be a mom. I can't have a kid. I'm going to be too sick. And I went to the conference, and actually that was one of my biggest questions was around PSC, having PSC and being a parent. It's rare. So your doctor may have seen a couple of people. You don't really have a large sample set. I came away from that first conference actually meeting young mothers who had kids. A lot of people were like, no, I've had this for 20 years. A whole variety of stories all of a sudden opened up that did not align with that 10-year statistic. I then became a conference junkie. I go every year, and I've gone every year since, and I'm very involved in the community. And because of my background in education, because of my background in community work, I thought this is something that a lot of people can't go to a conference. They can't fly across the country when it's conference time. And there are a lot of young women who have the same story. Statistically speaking, this is an older white male disease. I was a Latina in my 20s. I don't fit, again, in the statistic. So how does someone like me access information? That's when I decided to start a podcast. And my initial round of young women that I interviewed were people who were asking this question. Can I be a mom? Should I be a mom? Do I want to be a mom? And how does PSC affect that question? So that was my intention, was to say, there are other of us who get diagnosed and go right to the internet. And the information that we were finding at that time wasn't accurate. That was almost 12 years ago. According to the internet, I should not be here right now. So part of what my podcast, PSC Mommy, and that's Mommy, MAMI, does is that I interview women who've been in those positions and have asked that questions and have had a range of experiences. And I continue to seek out a range of experiences. And I've now I had my first dad on this last episode, and I'm currently working on an episode with a couple who's in the process of doing surrogacy. There are so many options. There's so many ways. There are so many questions, and there's some answers that can be accessed, but that your doctors aren't going to tell you. I saw you ask the question on the Facebook group, what does it feel like to be a parent and have an autoimmune condition? Like, your doctor usually can't tell you that. It's not part of their repertoire of things they can talk to you about with experience. How do you tell your child you're on your way to have a liver transplant when you get that call? How do you prepare for those days where you're so tired you can't get out of bed? How does that affect your relationship with your kids and your in-laws and your parents? And how do you do it? What's the support? So those are the kinds of things we talk about. I tell them, I don't want to know about your literal medical, what medicine you're taking. I want to know what it feels like. What was that conversation, right? When you and your husband sat down and said, I don't think we can have any more kids because of how I'm feeling. What did that feel like? And that, I think, is what people respond to. It is not an occasional podcast. I mean, I think right now, after 2 years, I have maybe 11 episodes up. It is very much when a story comes up, I'm open to putting it out there and people responding as they do. And it's been wonderful. It's been a great experience. And it's also allowed me then to create these relationships with the patient groups. There's a support group at one of the transplant centers here in town that also does a small conference. So they've had me come in and talk about women's health and from the perspective of a patient, and saying, what does it mean when you are pregnant and you're asking, what medications can I take? What can't I take? How do I access that information? Which, by the way, there's an amazing resource in Texas that you call. I'm going to get it to you so you can put it in the podcast notes. You call them and you say, here's the medication. And they have this amazing database that can say, here's how much is accessible to the baby through breast milk. Here's what we know about crossing the placental line, all of that stuff that just helps. There's no right answer when it comes to a pregnancy, and you always have to weigh a risk benefit. So in my pregnancy, there was a symptom, my itching. If I'm so stressed about my itching that's hurting my baby, is that more or less harmful than me taking this medication so I don't itch? Those are the questions that you have to ask about, and being able to talk to other women who've had to ask those really hard questions that no one can answer for you. That's kind of what motivated me to start it.
I love that. That's such a great point, or a couple of great points that you mentioned. This real conversation about what it really feels like to live in this body with this diagnosis and with this experience, to not just talk about the clinical checklist of side effects or decisions to choose to take medication or not, but to actually share what the life experience is like. I'm curious to hear about the demographics of the listeners or of your community, the people who are part of your podcast community. And I think a lot of autoimmune diseases tend to be, for various reasons, white male diseases. How have you been able to connect with other women of color?
For the most part, in connecting with other women, right? Many of them who I met through the conference, or the trickling, I start getting emails saying, I found your podcast. I want to share my story. Even though I don't feel like my podcast is very diverse. I know there's more women of color out there who have PSC. I just know it. But I think for the same reasons I can speculate about the same reasons why we say the populations are such. I think also the support spaces are also tend to be more white, and who shows up to these patient conferences. And I think it's a little bit more challenging, and I haven't quite figured out how to expand that. I open up with Latin music and I say, hola mamis, but if you're not already listening to that, you wouldn't connect on that level. It is a challenge because of who self-identifies and puts themselves out there. I actually had an infectious diseases doctor whose mom had PSC in Miami, and she does not access any of the support because she's Spanish speaking, and she just doesn't engage. She doesn't engage in the support systems that are out there because of that. Totally know that these folks are out there, hopefully through your podcast. Hello, PSCers, if you're listening, I'm here. Please connect with me. I would love to have that connection. It is something that is very present in the community, and I think I have talked to the patient supporter group. I mean, they know this is not an unknown issue, and I think we just, as a whole, struggle to kind of figure that piece out.
Hopefully others with PSC will listen to this podcast, see this episode out there. It's about rare diseases. The title is Let's Talk About Rare Disease Day, and it's going to be in the show notes featuring PSC. Yeah, I also deal with that same kind of dilemma with my podcast. There's a certain amount of energy that all of these different conversations require.
Absolutely.
And so it's about managing what we can do. We can't really do everything, and we do our part. I mean, just, of course, just being here, it's the
absolutely. I mean, if you think about, we're talking about rare diseases, right? You think of the entire population of PSCers is 30 to 40,000. Many of those people are doing fine. They're not looking for support. They're doing great. They're living their lives. They don't have symptoms. So excited for them. Like amount of women who are in childbearing age is even smaller than that. The amount of women of color in that small group is even smaller than that. So, I'm not going to even guess at the numbers, but I know that the audience, even just childbearing age women, is so small, which is why I'm comfortable with the podcast being occasional, right? Is that the people who need to find it, I hope will find it and put it out there. We put ourselves out there. Here's stories. And I think stories are really powerful for healing. They're really powerful for connection. There's something really beautiful about podcasts where you can hear someone's voice. I feel it's really different. And support groups and Facebook groups have a place, but being able to hear when like someone chokes up because they're talking about something that's really hard, I think is really powerful. So
yeah, even if your podcast is twice a year or just a few times a year, just that it's out there is powerful. And when it reaches somebody who really needs to hear it, somebody who has a rare disease and feels that nobody understands what it's like, it's going to be very welcomed and totally appreciated regardless of the numbers. What advice would you give to somebody who is dealing with a rare disease and is just dealing with that difficulty of people not understanding, the medical community not really quite understanding the context of this condition? What type of advice would you offer to someone?
I do some mentoring, both in person at the conferences and on the call. So the first piece of advice I always tell people is related to something I just said, which is there are lots of people with this condition who are doing just fine. And when you're doing just fine, you don't go on the message boards and say, hey guys, I'm doing just fine. I always remind people that message boards, forums are great places for support, but they're often skewed to people who are reaching out in a moment of crisis or struggle, saying things that we can't say to the people around us, to see that it's hard, saying that you're struggling. Our group is great in that occasionally, like your group of Limitless Living, right? Sort of saying, who's doing great? And people will be like, oh, I'm running a marathon and I'm doing this and I'm doing that. So that's one thing, is to just realize when I first went online, I thought my life was over. I thought it was done. I had a bucket list. I was crossing it off, literally actively crossing things, being like, all right, I love Cirque du Soleil. I'm going to go see that show because I might not be here in 5 years to see it. So that's one of the things, is to always remember that online groups are usually skewed for good reason towards people who are struggling. As far as within the medical community, this is a hard one. I started my trajectory in a really amazing medical community. My was amazing. at Brigham and Women's Hospital, shouting them out in Boston. They had just incredible communication. I never had to worry about mixed messages between my doctors, because when you have multiple conditions, when you add pregnancy in there, that communication is really key. I have since moved, changed teams 2 or 3 times, and am learning what it is to be an advocate for myself, keeping my own notes. I just had an appointment where they're like, you need to do this right there in the office. I made the phone call. I was like, let's be on the same page here. Thought something was happening that didn't happen. I thought I was supposed to wait for you. You thought I already did it. Let's all be on the same page. I'm making these phone calls right here, and I'm going to tell you exactly what that infusion center is saying. And I'm telling, like, let's figure this out. So I think there is, unfortunately, a lot of onus on the patient to like figure the system out. When we had our conference at the Cleveland Clinic, one of the women that presented was a patient advocate. And what's your job? How do you do that? Is that something even that I want to do in the future? Because it's so critical to have someone who can speak the language of the doctors and the patients and be that middle person. So asking at your hospital, asking social worker at the hospital, like, is there this position if you're feeling overwhelmed by that kind of thing? Because it is overwhelming. It is hard. I know, especially with rare diseases, visits to the emergency room can be really stressful because you both need to go. But when you get there, you feel like they don't really know what's going on, or sometimes give you contradictory advice to what your specialists are telling you. For me, it was very enlightening. My sister-in-law is an ER doctor, and she kind of framed it for me. She was like, my job as an ER doctor is to make sure that you're alive to go see your specialist. I can't know everything. And for me, having that frame helped me understand that role, and that you can't in the emergency room tell me what's going on necessarily. You just need to make sure I'm okay to figure it out with the people who will know. Okay, I'll buy that. But it's also scary. I have a friend who has a rare disease where literally a trip to the emergency room could be deadly because if she gets a certain medication or not. And she's worked really hard to pass legislation in her state so that that kind of care is present for them. So sometimes, it's our role, whether we want it or not, to even advocate to our legislatures to say, this is what needs to happen. This is a law that would protect lives. And they're not in a lot of us, but we count. We count. We vote. We're here. And it's really important. And that's exhausting, can I just say, when you often have fatigue, when you often have pain. So I just also want to say that that is part of the package. There have definitely been times where I'm not feeling like advocating, like I just want things to go the way they need to go. But I think that as having a rare disease, having to explain it to your family, having to explain it to your friends, that's where the patient groups are so critical, and finding other people, whether it be online or in person, to say, like, what have been the experiences about talking to a boss? What have been experiences of talking to when you're dating, right? Like, when do you disclose that you have this disease? At what point is it feel comfortable, feel right, feel fair? All of those are really tough questions. There's a book, Invisible, about young women. I don't know if you've read that one, about autoimmune disease in young women. So she goes through a lot of these issues. And me reading, I was just like, yep. Even if I hadn't personally had the experiences she was talking about, having mentored, having been in this space for a while, it's like, these questions are real. So what does that look like? I think for me, I've had to live in a space of gratitude, and that helps me a lot. I had the experience when I was at a college that I lived overseas, and in a space that the hospital was empty, and I was an interpreter for a hospital that didn't even have gloves. They were doing surgeries and they don't have pain medicine, and patients brought their own sheets to a hospital. So like, I've definitely had a feeling. I look around me in a hospital bed and I'm like, oh my God, this place is so well stocked compared to what I've seen. I think that allows me to live in a space of gratitude. And I do have a ton of privilege. My husband has a great job with amazing insurance, and that has afforded me life, literally. You cannot get a transplant if you do not have a way to pay for it, period. You cannot get a transplant if you don't have caregivers. My mom retired so she could be my caregiver right after transplant and during the waiting period, where I was like in her house getting sicker and sicker, waiting for the call to come. So there is a lot that goes into being able to keep us alive, right? And keeping us well, and the people around us are so important. And it's so hard when they're so important to us and they don't understand why they're so important to us.
No. I talk about these topics in some of the recent episodes. I talk about, actually in the very last episode, I talk about how we need to give special gratitude to mothers who have autoimmune conditions and they're taking care of their children. It's amazing. The energy that is required to care and raise a child just as a healthy human being is exhausting. So special gratitude for mothers and appreciation for mothers with autoimmune and chronic conditions. Also, we did an episode about caregivers the other day too, and just giving them appreciation as well, especially family members who are going through the diagnosis with us. They have to go through some extent of exactly what we're going through, living with the new health condition. It's part of their life now too, and important topics to address and
absolutely
give recognition to. Thank you so much. How can we get in touch with you? How can we find the podcast? How can we connect?
Absolutely. PSC Mommy is the podcast. So it's PSC and then MAMI. You can find that at the website pscmommy.com. We are on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter at PSC Mommy. Not super active on that. I sort of just post when there's a new episode that comes up. And my email, if someone wants to just reach out, is pscmommy@gmail.com. And there's a link to that in the website as well. I would love to hear from folks, especially if you're a PSCer out there. Please connect. We have a registry that allows for researchers to find all of us. So I think patient registries are critical when you have a rare disease, and there is one for PSC. So if you have that and haven't registered, please go to pscpartners.org, and they have a prominent link there. And yeah, thank you so much for inviting me and having me and connecting. I think I've read that when you add all the autoimmune diseases all up together, that is a massive number. And it's kind of incredible that it doesn't get more attention and more research than they already do.
Yeah, we exceed the number of people with cancer altogether. So thank you so much for being here. And we will do our part to communicate the message about PSC and rare disease awareness.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to today's episode on the Sisterhood of Limitless Living podcast. If you enjoyed our episode, please feel free to leave us a review on iTunes or subscribe. You can also find out more about the Sisterhood of Limitless Living by joining us in our Facebook group, facebook.com/groups/SL3Limitless. And to find out more about Dr. April Moreno and autoimmune integrative wellness, visit www.aprilmorenophd.com. On Instagram at Dr. April Wellness. Take care and have a great day.